Here we're going to take a look at primary sources that are oftentimes consulted in the study of the New Testament. So we'll begin, first of all, with the Apocrypha. This English word Apocrypha comes from the Greek apokrypto, which means to hide or to conceal. It refers to a collection of books that were thought to contain hidden or secret truths. These books are considered to be deuterocanonical by a Roman Catholic Church, and they include such books as First and Second Maccabees, Judith, Ben Sira, and the Wisdom of Solomon. And so these are very valuable books to get a sense of the way in which Second Temple Jews thought about issues, thought about the world, expressed their faith in God. And it's kind of important because these books as well reflect the type of thinking that we also find in the New Testament. There's also the source known as the Septuagint. This is English word, comes from the Latin, which means for 70. And it's really the reference to the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was completed sometime in the 3rd century BC. Again, this is a very valuable source for us to be aware of because many times in the New Testament, which is obviously written in Greek, the scriptures that are referenced are those that are from the Greek Septuagint. Now, there may be occasions in which an author is paraphrasing a passage or maybe working off of their own translation or rendition of a Hebrew script, but most of the time they are referencing something that's out of the Septuagint. And so we should become familiar with this source as we study the New Testament. There's also the pseudepigrapha, which is a great deal of sources. This word, typically the transliteration of the Greek word, which means things bearing a false ascription. And what we have here is lots of sources that purport to be from someone other than who the actual author was. So you'll have something like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, or you might have something called First Enoch, or you may have something called the Apocalypse of Abraham. And so you're going to have a number of sources that have the name of somebody else. Again, this is sources that were constructed during the Second Temple period and even after the Second Temple period. So in other words, after AD 70. And once again, it kind of reflects the diversity of Judaism at this time and the different ideas that Jews had, different hopes, aspirations, the way in which they interacted with non-Jews. And again, very valuable for us to make comparisons with what we see by Jewish Christians who are writing the New Testament. Both Jewish and Christian writings from the period between 200 BC to 200 AD. So when I say both Jewish and Christian writings, some of the pseudepigrapha was taken over. Some of the Jewish writings were taken over by Christians. They were adapted, amended, edited, so that these sources could point to Jesus or could point to the Christian faith as the kind of legitimate heir to Jewish faith, and so or being somehow or another kind of a continuation of Jewish faith. And so that's why I'm calling it Christian writings as well. There are also Christian pseudepigrapha, so things like the Acts of Thecla, or the other books like the Book of Thomas or the Gospel of Thomas. These are pseudepigraphical writings, but they also happen to come from a particular source, which we'll talk about in a minute. So usually these texts are attributed to ideal figures in Israel or in the church's past. So, sometimes we'll have the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene or the Gospel according to Peter, or you'll have the Testament of Abraham or the writings of Baruch, first Baruch, second Baruch. These are figures from the time. You'll have works supposedly from Adam, and so these ideal figures of the past are kind of used as spokespersons for the author's ideas. And so the whole activity of pseudepigraphy is very important, because when we look at New Testament books, or even some Old Testament books, we have to raise the question of who is the author, and who proclaims to be the author, and is someone pretending to be that author, or to be that person. And so because pseudepigraphy is an activity that was quite common, or common enough, I should say, common enough that it becomes a real possibility for writings that also come to be in the New Testament. All these books claim to contain some kind of message from God, and so these writings are not just about history in some kind of objective sense, but they're really trying to express something about what God is doing in the world, what God wants from his people, or how God's people ought to live. The Old Testament pseudepigrapha is built on a narrative, or the ideals of the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls are also another very important primary source, discovered in the late 1940s, and then really kind of worked and brought together over the last several decades. There are about 850 manuscripts, maybe even more so, that has since been discovered and found out near the Wadi Qumran, near the Dead Sea. And so these sources gives us an insight into a particular sect, or a particular group of Jews. Portions of all of the Old Testament, maybe with the exception of Esther, maybe some others, but primarily Esther, are found. And so that's a great find. This really jumped our evidence for the presence of the Old Testament text some 1,000 years, because that before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, our oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament dated around 1000 AD. And so now we all of a sudden have Hebrew scripts of the Old Testament that are dating to, the 1st century BC. So a huge and monumental discovery. Other documents that were found included the community rules, commentaries, eschatological liturgical works. Another key person to get familiar with is Philo of Alexandria in North Egypt. Belonged to a highly prominent family. He was trained in Hellenistic rhetoric and philosophies, particularly influenced by Middle Platonism. And he wrote extensively on Mosaic laws, tried to show that both Moses and Plato were speaking about the same reality. So Philo is a good example of a very thoroughly Hellenized Jew. That is, a Jew who kind of was influenced by Greek thought, Greek worldviews, Greek ideals, and sought to assimilate those ideals with his own Jewish faith. He authored a number of works, such as Questions and Answers on Genesis and Exodus, on the contemplative life, that every good person is free, so even some more philosophical abstract ideas. So, and you'll see by those dates, 20 BC to 50 AD, that he really is kind of a contemporary of Jesus, and probably just right before the Apostle Paul. So making comparisons between Paul and Philo is something a number of scholars will do. Josephus is another extremely important work. Wrote what was up to that time the most extensive and systematic history of the Jewish people. He is the earliest non-Christian to mention individuals referred to the New Testament. He does make reference to John the Baptist, to Jesus' brother James, to Judas the Galilean, and possibly even to Jesus himself, though his reference to Jesus is suspect for some scholars, but I think most scholars do seem to recognize that, yes, Josephus is the one who is responsible for making some descriptions about Jesus, but only kind of on the side, as he is really talking about John the Baptist. He presents the earliest systematic and comprehensive paraphrase interpretations of the Old Testament, and authored a number of important works that we do use in comparing historical information for the first century and even earlier. So like the Jewish Wars, Jewish Antiquities. He did his own autobiography, which referred to his life, and Against Apion is where he responds to an anti-Semitic author. The Nag Hammadi Library is a collection of Coptic papyri, papyrus writings discovered in 1945-46 near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, which located in Upper Egypt. 52 texts and 12 codices and 12 books that date back to around the 4th century. These are mostly Gnostic in nature, so they reveal a form of Christianity influenced by Gnostic thought. We can talk about, or you should investigate, Gnosticism, because while this was not so much a 1st century heresy, it is a 2nd century issue that the 2nd century church has to deal with, and it's very important. It has some ideas that may be reflected in New Testament writings. And one of the sources that are most interesting is the Gospel of Thomas, because it's a collection of sayings of Jesus, and some of these sayings are sayings we also find in our canonical books, and making comparison to this. Some have argued Gospel of Thomas may be 1st century, but I tend to think it's more likely a very early 2nd century. The last one we'll look at here is Mishnah. Mishnah is, this word comes from the Hebrew word mishnah, meaning study or repetition, and it's a collection of Jewish legal materials based on rabbinic debates, codified in the late 2nd century AD by Judah the Patriarch, and it demonstrates how rabbis sought to apply biblical laws on new settings. So when you want to think about Jews and how they interpreted the law, how they applied the law, this is an important source to be aware of and to consult. And so that gives us a very quick, brief review of the primary sources that are used in New Testament studies.